Hello, and welcome to another video lecture for Mr. Moser's 8th grade U.S. History class. This is the final lecture looking at the end of World War I. The textbook reading for this particular lecture comes from the section titled Establishing Peace, pages 735 to 739. Kind of our central questions is, what was the League of Nations? Why did some Americans not want to be involved with this organization? What are some key parts to President Wilson's 14 points peace plan? And then what was the Treaty of Versailles? How was Germany punished after the World War War? And then what were some of the lasting legacies of World War I? World War I comes to an end in large part and helps with just a wearing out of Germany. For the last 4 years, Germany has just been beaten down by the allies of the French and by the Belgians and by the British and Canadians and all the other parts of the English Commonwealth. And they're starving in submission here. With a new, fresh American troops coming onto the battlefield, we're starting to see some advancements of the Allies being able to push more so into Germany. But Germany is starving, about 800 dying a day of starvation. Germany's other allies, the Ottoman Empire, Austria and Hungary, they're starting to quit the war, and they're starting to form treaties with the Allies and surrendering. And then finally, Germany, the leader, Kaiser Wilhelm, decides, this is it. We can't keep fighting any longer, and so they decide to surrender. And the armistice, which officially ends World War I, takes place on which is a peace treaty, basically a truce, a ceasefire, goes into effect on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. So this is known as November 11th, 1918. Today, in the United States, we call this Veterans Day. In other parts of the world, especially in Europe, it's known as Armistice Day. In England, it's known as Remembrance Day, for them to remember the fallen of World War I. And if you see the photograph over here, this is a picture of the Tower of London in England that was decorated in Remembrance Day in 2014 with a field of poppies. Each poppy, which is a little plastic flower in this particular artwork, represents one of the dead of England during World War I. And as you can see, this massive field of poppies. So a lot of people died in World War I. A lot of soldiers died in World War I, especially in Europe, especially in England and France and Germany, where it's a little bit more remembered than maybe more so than the United States. President Wilson and the leaders of the Allies will have a conference in Paris to discuss the end of the war and kind of the consequences for Germany for going to war. Wilson goes with a plan he calls his 14 points peace plan. It's peace without victory, is what he calls it. In his plan, he says that he believes that the nations of the world should focus on making smaller armies, not massively building up. This goes back to one of our causes, militarism. So countries will be less likely to go to war if they have small armies. And no more secret alliances, no more secret treaties, which was another one of the causes of World War I. Remember, alliances. He also wanted to encourage democracies to have free trade. He says that countries who are trading with each other are less likely to go to war with each other. So he encouraged this idea of free trade. He felt that Austria and Hungary and the Ottoman empires, who were fighting on the side of Germany and the Central Powers, had gotten too large, and so he encouraged them to get smaller, break them up into smaller regions and smaller sections, and to give independence to the colonies. There is that other cause, imperialism. He says that some of these colonies should have their own independence, especially the ones controlled of the Central Powers. He probably figures that Great Britain isn't going to get rid of their colonies, but at least for the Central Powers in the Ottoman, Austrian-Hungarian, and the German colonies, they should have their independence. And Wilson calls for a new national body, a new national or international organization of countries from around the world to settle disputes peacefully and promote peace, and he called it the League of Nations. It sounds like something from a comic book, like the Super League. It's the League of Nations, this idea of countries working together to work on their disputes here. Wilson goes to Paris. He goes to the Palace of Versailles in France with the other allies to negotiate this treaty. He's very optimistic. He's really hopeful that the other allies leaders go for it, and they don't. Most of the European leaders who are sick of the war after 4 years, have suffered tremendous casualties in this war, reject most of Wilson's plan. They really are in the mood of punishing the Central Powers, specifically Germany. They feel Germany is at the root cause of this conflict. The leaders blame Germany for the conflict, and they want to punish Germany. They want to teach Germany a lesson so it doesn't go to war ever again. Germany is forced to pay war reparations of about $33 billion in destructions to the allies of Belgium, France, and Great Britain. So this is a huge, huge tab back then that Germany was responsible for. Now remember, Germany had to pay for their own war too. So not only are they having to pay their own debts from this years of fighting, but they also are going to have to pay these reparations, which are just not going to go over very well in Germany, as we're going to find out. The Ottoman Empire, which is basically modern-day Turkey, and the Austro-Hungarian empires are kind of broken up into smaller countries, which was something that Wilson was agreeable to, and some of the allies were agreeable to do that with the Central Powers too. So we can see here, before World War I, here is the area of Germany. Here's the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and you can see after the war, Germany kind of shrinks here a little bit. There's some different countries added here along the Baltic Sea, but Austria-Hungary is broken up into different countries of Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Hungary. Romania, or Romania as it was called, is a little bit larger, but there's kind of some redrawing of some borders, especially in Europe, and even in some of the colonies of the Central Powers as well, especially in places like the Middle East. The maps are completely redrawn, which is going to create some future tensions down the road. There's a teaser for you as we get going here. Wilson comes home, really trying to sell what he was able to salvage of his 14 points plan. Again, Europe did agree that a League of Nations sounded to them like a good idea, some kind of international body of nations that could help settle future disputes so that maybe war wouldn't be a result. So Wilson comes home with at least that part of his plan still intact, and he's trying to convince Congress that America should ratify this Treaty at Versailles and join the League of Nations. Congress refuses, in large part by this concern of America being drawn into world conflicts, this idea that it's not America's concern to be involved in other countries' affairs. What sums up probably is this quote from Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, senator from Massachusetts. He says, "I wish the American people carefully to consider whether they are willing to have the youth of America ordered to war by other nations." And there's just not enough public sentiment to join this League of Nations. And they're just worried that if we do join this organization that it's just going to draw us into future conflicts. There's a lot of bitterness when the war comes to an end in America because of the casualties and the cruelty and the violence of the war, that America really didn't want to get involved in another conflict really ever again. And there just wasn't really any sentiment to do so. There was just a lot of animosity about how the war came about, how America got involved, and just people coming back from the war with shell shock and just were kind of changed, the veterans that were changed. People said, we're not going to get involved in this conflict anymore. Wilson really tries to push hard for this, but unfortunately he suffers from a horrible stroke and never really fully recovers throughout the rest of his presidency. And he's not able to help push the country behind this League of Nations effort, and it fails. And so the United States never does join the League of Nations. It primarily is a European organization with some countries in Asia, and some other places around the world, but the United States never does join the League of Nations, which is going to be kind of a foreshadowing here of things to come here as we get into World War II. The League of Nations is going to not be able to prevent that conflict, and so we're going to kind of see how that plays out here in the coming weeks. So again, there's a little bit of a teaser coming for you that there's some things happening here at the end of World War I that are going to kind of set the scene here for World War II. So the war's over, but what happens next? Well, as we learned already, because we've kind of skipped around here a little bit, America goes into the Roaring '20s, which for us was a pretty prosperous time period, which is why we call it the Roaring '20s. The economy was doing very well. People had jobs. This is the era of jazz. This is the era of music and pop culture and consumerism. Things are going very, very well for us in our country in the 1920s. But in Europe, things aren't going very well, especially in the late 20s and early 30s, especially in Germany. Germany is extremely angry by how they felt they were treated at the Treaty of Versailles. They didn't like the fact that their countries were broken into smaller pieces and some of their land was taken away. This idea of some German nationality was no longer part of Germany and Austria, that they had been kind of broken off. There's a lot of anger and resentment about these reparations that Germany has to pay France and Great Britain, that they feel is not fair for them. And so it creates this climate in Germany of anger about the war, There's high unemployment during this time period. A lot of Germans are out of work. The country is really struggling to kind of get on its feet. And this is going to kind of set up the scene to the rise of the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler coming to power in Germany, which we'll get to here in the coming weeks. And so probably the legacies of World War I, what are the lessons learned of World War I? Well, there's a couple of things that come out of World War I. One is that the League of Nations will be created. America will not join it, but it will be created. And we'll find out that it will not prevent the lead up to World War II. And so it's going to be kind of a failed organization. It creates a very ripe climate, especially in Germany, for the rise of power of Adolf Hitler and the National German Socialist Workers' Party. And that's going to come out in the late 20s, not very successful, but will gain traction in the early 30s, and Hitler will come to power, which is going to be a game changer in Europe, as we're going to find out in the coming days. The other consequences of the World War I is it does cause the end of the Romanov Tsarist Empire. Romanovs were the kind of the kings of Russia. When during the war, their economy, their country collapses and is overthrown by Vladimir Lenin and the Soviets, the Marxists, the communists, and they reorganize Russia into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the Soviet Union, under a new communist country. And so communism becomes a very big thing in the forefront in the world, also in the United States. In the US, we have something called the Red Scare, kind of the fear of communism at home in the 1920s, which is a fear that this could maybe try to overthrow American government because of problems in labor unions and factories and workers, and labor strikes and government raids on some radicals that were kind of pro-communism. So we have that Red Scare, that kind of rise of communism as well. So when we think about World War I, America is really not involved a whole lot into the conflict, which is why in most U.S. history courses it's just very briefly glossed over. But the legacy of World War I is really the setting up of the Soviet Union, which will be led by Lenin, and eventually it's going to be led by Stalin, who we'll talk about later on. And then we're going to look at Adolf Hitler coming to power in Germany as well. So that's really kind of the key, in terms of American history, the legacies of World War I is kind of setting the scene, stage for the coming conflicts. So there's your teaser for you. What's coming up next? World War II. And so we'll be kind of looking at those topics here coming up. So thanks for listening. As always, if you have questions or concerns, please make sure you come talk to your teacher. I hope this lecture has kind of helped you kind of look at some of the legacies and impact of World War I. Now every year on November 11th, we celebrate Veterans Day as a day of remembrance to not just the soldiers who died in World War I, but all American soldiers who died in World War I, who sacrificed themselves in all of our conflicts that we've been involved in. So thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you later.